On this day in history, March 1st, 1476, forces of the Catholic monarchs engaged the combined Portuguese-Castilian armies of Afonso V and Prince John at the Battle of Toro. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Toro, a town of Spain in the province of Zamora, on the right bank of the river Douro, and on the Zamora-Medellin del Campo Railway. Population from 1930, 7,700. Toro is an ancient fortified town with picturesque narrow streets. A fine bridge spans the river. The Catholic Church is Romanesque. It dates from the 12th century, but has been partially restored. The palace of the Marqueses of Santa Cruz was the meeting place of the Cortes of 1371, 1442, and 1505, which made Toro and its code of laws celebrated. On this day in history, March 2nd, 986, Louis V becomes the last Carolingian king of West Francia after the death of his father, Lothair. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Louis V. Louis V, born 967, died 987, La Fainéant, King of France, succeeded his father Lothair in March 986, and finally embroiled the Carolingian dynasty with Hugh Capet and Adalberon, Archbishop of Reims. Louis died in May 987, his mother Emma being accused of having poisoned him. On this day in history, March 3rd, 1799, the Russo-Ottoman siege of Corfu ends with the surrender of the French garrison. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Corfu. In local tradition, Corcyra was the Homeric island of Scheria, the home of the Phoenicians. In early Greek times, it was colonized from Corinth, but seems to have had earlier settlers from Eritrea. The position of Corcyra, on the highway between Greece and the West, favored rapid growth and freedom of action, and its people, contrary to the practice of Corinthian colonies, maintained an independent and even hostile attitude towards the mother city. In the early part of the 7th century, their fleets fought the first naval battle recorded in Greek history, about 664 BC. The Corinthian tyrant Periander, circa 600, governed Corcyra by deputy, and induced it to join in the colonization of Apollonia and Anacatorium. But the island regained its independence and devoted itself to purely mercantile policy. During the Persian invasion of 480, it manned 60 ships, but took no active part. In 435, in a quarrel with Corinth, it sought assistance from Athens. This was one of the chief immediate causes of the Peloponnesian War, in which Corcyra was of considerable use to the Athenians as a naval station and a base for supplies, though it was twice nearly lost to Athens by internal feuds. On each occasion, 427 and 425, the popular party ultimately won. After a third abortive rising in 410, it passed out of the war. In 375, a fresh Athenian alliance resulted in hostilities with Sparta. In the Hellenistic period, Corcyra was besieged by Cassander, and occupied in turn by Agathocles Pyrrhus and Illyrian corsairs. From these last, in 229, it was delivered by the Romans, who retained it as a naval base and made it a free state. In 31 BC, Octavian used it as a base against Antony, but his victory foundation, Nicopolis, soon outrivaled it, and Corcyra for long passed out of notice. With the rise of the Norman kingdom in Sicily and the Italian naval powers, Corcyra became a frequent object of attack. In 1081 to 1085, it was held by Robert Guiscard. In 1147 to 1154 by Roger II of Sicily. In 1197 to 1207 by Genovese privateers who were expelled by the Venetians. In 1214 to 1259, it passed to the Greek despots of Epirus, and in 1267 to the Neapolitan house of Anjou. Under this weak rule, the island suffered from various adventurers. In 1386, it placed itself under the protection of Venice, and in 1401 under its formal sovereignty. Corcyra remained in Venetian hands till 1797, though several times attacked by the Turks, with notable sieges in 1536 and 1716 to 1718. Under Venetian feudalism, the island took the new name of Corfu. The Corfiotes were encouraged to cultivate the olive, but were debarred from commercial competition with Venice. The island served as a refuge for Greek scholars from Turkish conquests, and in 1732 became the home of the first academy of modern Greece. But no serious impulse to Greek thought came from this quarter. By the Treaty of Campo Formio, Corfu was ceded to the French, until they were expelled by a Russo-Turkish armament, 1799. For a short time it became the capital of the self-governing Federation of the Heftanissos, 7 islands. In 1807, its faction-ridden government was again replaced by a French administration, and in 1809 it was attacked by a British fleet. By the Treaty of Paris of November 5, 1815, the Ionian Islands were placed under the protectorate of Great Britain, and Corfu became the seat of the British High Commissioner. Though the native Senate and Assembly were retained, British administration improved conditions, but its strictness displeased the natives, and in 1864 Corfu was ceded with the other Ionian Islands to the Kingdom of Greece, in accordance with the wishes of the inhabitants. Although the neutralization of Corfu was maintained after the Balkan Wars, its military importance grew so greatly during World War I, after the Serbian retreat across Albania, that the French, ignoring a Greek protest, landed there on January 11, 1916. They were followed by the first detachment of retreating Serbs 4 days later, and by February 10th, some 75,000 Serbian troops, as well as Montenegrin soldiers, had been landed in the island, whither on the previous day the Serbian government had transported its seat, and where, on September 10th, the Serbian parliament met in the theater. In July 1917, the Pact of Corfu was signed, which proclaimed the union of the Yugoslavs. On October 27, 1923, the Italian delegate for the delimitation of the Albanian frontier, General Tellini, was assassinated at Cracovia. There was no proof that the assassins were Greek, but Signor Mussolini held the Hellenic government responsible and sent an Italian fleet to Corfu, which bombarded the town and killed several Greek and Armenian refugees. After extracting from Greece 50 million lira as an indemnity, the Italians evacuated Corfu. In World War II, the island was bombed heavily by the Italians. It fell to the Germans during the Balkan Campaign of April 1941. On this day in history, March 4th, 306, the martyrdom of St. Adrian of Nicomedia occurs. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Adrian. Adrian, saint, one of the Praetorian Guards of the Emperor Galerius Maximian, who, becoming a convert to Christianity, was martyred at Nicomedia on March 4th, 303. His limbs were struck off on an anvil, and he was then beheaded. St. Adrian's festival, with that of his wife, St. Natalia, is kept on September 8th. He is specially a patron of soldiers, and is much reverenced in Flanders, Germany, and the north of France. On this day in history, March 5th, 1811, as part of the Peninsular War, a French force under the command of Marshal Victor is routed while trying to prevent an Anglo-Spanish-Portuguese army from lifting the siege of Cadiz in the Battle of Barossa. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the battle itself. Barossa, Battle of 1811. In February 1811, the garrison of Cadiz made a sortie in the hope of raising the siege. 10,000 Spaniards and 4,000 British under the Spaniard La Peña sailed to Tarifa, and thence marched back towards Cadiz, intending to take the besiegers in rear. Victor, the French commander, sent Villatte to block the road to Cadiz, where it ran over the Bermeja Peninsula. This peninsula was a strip of land 3 miles wide, formed by the sea on one side and the Almansa Creek on the other. Across its southern or mainland end stretched the Chiclana forest, and beyond this rose a low ridge known as the Heights of Barossa, which commanded the entrance to the peninsula. La Peña encountered Villatte after passing through the Chiclana forest, and, after a sharp fight, drove him over the Almansa Creek. Sir Thomas Graham, commanding the British contingent, wished to occupy the heights of Barossa, but La Peña, whose one desire now was to re-enter Cadiz, peremptorily ordered him to continue his march. Graham reluctantly obeyed, but as he was passing through the forest, he heard that Victor, with 7,000 men, was advancing from the east. Realizing the importance of the heights of Barossa, Victor ordered Ruffin to occupy their southern extremity, and Laval their northern. Graham, though he had only 4,000 men, immediately decided to recover the heights. Here, therefore, sent Dilke's brigade against Ruffin, and Wheatley's against Laval. In spite of a murderous fire of musketry and artillery, Dilke's men steadily advanced on to the ridge line, halted to pour a volley into the French masses on its crest, and charging, drove them headlong off the heights. Wheatley met with even greater success. His line, emerging from the forest, took Laval's columns by surprise, and inflicted terrible losses upon them. Laval's supports fled without firing a shot, and joined Ruffin's retreating division. The losses on both sides were extremely heavy. The British, out of 4,000 men, losing 1,200, and the French 2,000 out of 7,000. On a small scale, it was one of the finest achievements of British arms in the war. On this day in history, March 6, 1521, Ferdinand Magellan arrives at Guam. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the island. Guam was discovered by Magellan in 1521. He was so much annoyed by the thefts which were committed by the natives that he gave the whole group of islands to which Guam belongs the name Islas de la Ladrones, Thieves' Islands. The name has still persisted to some extent, although the official name of the group was later established as Mariana, in honor of the widow of King Philip IV of Spain. There was no attempt to conquer Guam until the latter part of the 17th century, when the Spaniards subdued the island after considerable bloodshed. It remained a Spanish possession until 1898, when the U.S. warship, Charlestown, steamed into the harbor of Apra and commenced to shell the old fort. The Spanish governor, cut off from the communication with the outside world, took this as a friendly salute and surrendered the island without opposition when the situation was explained to him. Guam was ceded to the United States, and the other islands of the Marianas were sold by Spain to Germany in 1899. After World War I, Japan, which had occupied the German island possessions north of the equator, received these South Sea islands, the Marianas, Caroline, and Marshall groups, as a mandate under the League of Nations. Japan retained possession of the islands after it quit the League in 1935. Guam was entirely demilitarized after the Washington Treaty of Naval Limitation of 1922. The position of Guam in a U.S.-Japanese war was certain to be precarious, because the island is surrounded by the Micronesian islands which Japan controls. The nearest of these islands, Rota, is only about 30 miles to the north of Guam. The question of fortifying Guam came up sporadically for consideration after Japan had denounced the Washington Treaty and thereby opened the way to fortification of the island possessions of other powers. Congress was never willing to appropriate funds for the purpose, partly because of the belief that such a move might precipitate war with Japan, partly because of doubt in the minds of some naval experts as to whether Guam, in its exposed position, could be made secure against air bombardment. Some funds for harbor improvement and provision of air facilities were voted in 1941, and a number of skilled workers were brought over from the United States in that year. But the force at Guam, some 400 Marines and about 155 sailors, was quite inadequate to protect an island which, with its fairly extensive coastline, offered a number of opportunities for landing to an attacking force. The Japanese effected landings in Guam in the first days of the war with the U.S., and the occupation of the island was apparently completed on December 12, 1941. On this day in history, March 7, 1138, Conrad III von Hohenstaufen was elected King of Germany at Koblenz in the presence of the papal legate Theodwin. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the life of Conrad. Conrad III, born 1093, died 1152, German king, second son of Frederick I, Duke of Swabia, and Agnes, daughter of the Emperor Henry IV, was the first king of the Hohenstaufen family. His father died in 1105, and his mother married secondly Leopold III, Margrave of Austria. In 1115, his uncle, the Emperor Henry V, appointed him Duke of Franconia. In 1116, together with his elder brother Frederick II, Duke of Swabia, he was left by Henry as regent of Germany, and when the emperor died in 1125, he became titular king of Burgundy, or Arles. In 1126 he took part in the war between his brother Frederick and the new king, Lothair the Saxon, and was chosen king in opposition to Lothair on December 18th, 1127. Hastening across the Alps, he was crowned King of Italy at Monza in June 1128, and in spite of the papal ban was generally acknowledged in northern Italy. The rival popes, Innocent II and Anacletus II, both declared against him. The Romans repudiated him, and after failing to seize the extensive possessions left by Matilda, Marchioness of Tuscany, he returned to Germany in 1132. He continued the struggle against Lothair till October 1135, when he submitted, was pardoned, and recovered his estates. In 1136 he accompanied the imperial forces to Italy in the capacity of standard-bearer, and sought to win the favor of Pope Innocent II. In December 1137 Lothair died, and some of the princes met at Koblenz, and chose Conrad for a second time as German king on March 7, 1138, in the presence of the papal legate. Crowned at Aix-la-Chapelle 6 days later, he was acknowledged at Bamberg by several of the South German princes, but his position could not be strong while Henry the Proud, the powerful Duke of Bavaria and Saxony, refused his allegiance. Attempts at a peaceful settlement of this rivalry failed, and Henry was placed under the ban in July 1138, when war broke out in Bavaria and Saxony. The king was unable to make much headway, in spite of the death of the Duke Henry, which occurred in October 1139, and his half-brother Leopold IV, Margrave of Austria, to whom Bavaria had been entrusted, was defeated by Henry's brother Welf, afterwards Duke of Spoleto and Margrave of Tuscany. Conrad captured the fortress of Weissenberg from Welf in December 1140, and is said to have allowed the women to leave the town, each with as much of her property as she could carry on her back. To his surprise, so the story runs, each woman came out bearing on her back a husband, a father, or a brother, who thus escaped the conquerors. Peace was made at Frankfurt in May 1142, when Henry the Lion, son of Henry the Proud, was confirmed in the Duchy of Saxony, while Bavaria was given to Conrad's stepbrother, Henry Josemgert, Margrave of Austria, who married Gertrude, the widow of Henry the Proud. Affairs in Italy demanded the attention of the king, as Roger I, King of Sicily, had won considerable authority on the mainland and refused to recognize the German king, whose help Pope Lucius II implored against the rebellious Romans. This state of affairs drove Conrad into alliance with the East Roman Emperor Manuel Comnenus, who, in 1146, married his stepsister. But the condition of Germany prevented the contemplated campaign against Roger. The solitary success amid the general disorder in the empire was the expedition undertaken in 1142 by Conrad into Bohemia, where he restored his brother-in-law, Ladislao, to this throne. At an attempt, however, to perform the same service for another brother-in-law, also called Ladislao, who had been driven from his Polish dukedom, ended in failure. Disorder was rampant in Saxony, Bavaria, and Burgundy, and in 1146 war broke out between the Bavarians and the Hungarians. A term was placed to this condition of affairs by the preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux, and the consequent departure of many turbulent nobles on crusade. In December 1146, the king himself took the cross, secured the election and coronation of his young son Henry as his successor, appointed Henry I, Archbishop of Mainz, as his guardian, and set out for Palestine in the autumn of 1147. Marching with a large and splendid army through Hungary, he reached Asia Minor, where his forces were decimated by disease and by the sword. Stricken by illness, Conrad returned to Constantinople at Christmas 1147, but in March 1148 set out to rejoin his troops. Having shared in the fruitless attack on Damascus, he left Palestine in September 1148 and passed the ensuing winter at Constantinople, where he made fresh plans for an attack on Roger of Sicily. He reached Italy by sea, but the news that Roger had allied himself with Louis VII, King of France, and his old opponent, Welf of Bavaria, compelled him to return hastily to Germany. He was obliged to neglect repeated invitations from the Romans, who sent him a specially urgent letter in 1149, and consequently never received the imperial crown. Conrad died on February 15, 1152, at Bamberg, where he was buried. By his wife Gertrude, daughter of Berenger, Count of Sulzbach, He had 2 sons, the elder of whom, Henry, died in 1150. Passing over his younger son Frederick on account of his youth, he appointed as his successor his nephew, Frederick III, Duke of Swabia, afterwards the Emperor Frederick I. On this day in history, March 8, 1126, following the death of his mother, Queen Urraca of Leon, Alfonso VII is proclaimed King of Leon. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Alfonso. Alfonso VII, the Emperor, from 1126 to 1157, is a dignified and somewhat enigmatical figure. A vague tradition had always assigned the title of Emperor to the sovereign who held Leon as the most direct representative of the Visigoth kings, who were themselves the representatives of the Roman Empire. But though given in charters and claimed by Alfonso VI and the Battler, the title had been little more than a flourish of rhetoric. Alfonso VII was crowned emperor in 1135, after the death of the Battler. The weakness of Aragon enabled him to make his superiority effective. He appears to have striven for the formation of a national unity, which Spain had never possessed since the fall of the Visigoth kingdom. The elements he had to deal with could not be welded together. Alfonso was at once a patron of the Church and a protector, if not a favorer, of the Mohammedans, who formed a large part of his subjects. His reign ended in an unsuccessful campaign against the rising power of the Almohades. Though he was not actually defeated, his death in the pass of Moradel in the Sierra Morena, while on his way back to Toledo, occurred in circumstances which showed that no man could be what he claimed to be, king of the men of the 2 religions. His personal character does not stand out with the emphasis of those of Alfonso VI or the Battler. Yet he was a great king, the type and, to some extent, the victim of the confusions of his age, Christian in creed and ambition, but more than half Oriental in his household. On this day in history, March 9, 1862, as part of the American Civil War, the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, rebuilt from the engines and lower hull of the USS Merrimac, fight to withdraw in the Battle of Hampton Roads, the first battle between 2 ironclad warships. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the battles of the Merrimac and the Monitor. Monitor and Merrimac, Battle of, a naval engagement which was fought early in the American Civil War, notable as the first conflict between ironclad vessels. In the spring of 1861, the Federals set fire to several war vessels in the Gasport Navy Yard on the Elizabeth River, Virginia, and abandoned the place. In June, the Confederates set to work to raise one of these abandoned vessels, the frigate Merrimac, of 3,500 tons and 40 guns, and to rebuild it as an ironclad. The vessel, renamed the Virginia, though she is generally known in history by her original name, was first cut down to the waterline, and upon her hull was built a rectangular casemate, constructed of heavy timber, 24 inches in thickness. Covered with bar iron 4 inches thick, and rising from the water on each side at an angle of about 35 degrees, the iron plating extended 2 feet below the waterline, and beyond the casemate toward the bow was a cast-iron pilot-house extending 3 feet above the deck. The reconstruction of the vessel was completed on March 5, 1862. She drew 22 feet of water, was equipped with poor engines, so that she could not make more than 5 knots, and was so unwieldy that she could not be turned in less than 30 minutes. She was armed with 10 guns, 2 rifled 7-inch, 2 rifled 6-inch, and 6 smooth-bore Dahlgren 9-inch. Her most powerful equipment, however, was her 18-inch cast-iron ram. In October 1861, Captain John Erickson, an engineer, and a Troy, New York firm, as builders began the construction of the ironclad Monitor for the Federals at Greenport, Long Island. For the idea of the low freeboard and the revolving turret, Erickson was indebted to Theodore R. Timby, born 1819, died 1909, who in 1843 had filed a caveat for revolving towers for offensive or defensive warfare, whether placed on land or water, with a view to enable this vessel to carry at good speed the thickest possible armor compatible with buoyancy. Erickson reduced the exposed surface to the least possible area. Accordingly, the vessel was built so low in the water that the waves glided easily over its deck, except at the middle, where was constructed the revolving turret for the guns, and though the vessel's iron armor had a thickness of 1 inch on the deck, 5 inches on the side and 8 inches on the turret, its draft was only 10 feet 6 inches, or less than one half that of the Merrimac. Its turret, 9 feet high and 20 feet in inside diameter, seems small for its length of 172 feet, and its breadth of 41 feet 6 inches. And this, with the lowness of its freeboard, caused the vessel to be called the Yankee cheese box on a raft. Forward of the turret was the iron pilot house, square in shape, and rising about 4 feet above the deck. The Monitor's displacement was about 1,200 tons, and her armament was 2 11-inch Dahlgren guns. Her crew numbered 58, while that of the Merrimac numbered about 300. She was seaworthy in the shallow waters of the southern coasts and steered fairly well. The Monitor was launched at Greenpoint, Long Island, January 30th, and was turned over to the government on February 19th. The building of the two vessels was practically a race between the two combatants. On March 8th, about 1 p.m., the Merrimac, commanded by Commodore Franklin Buchanan, born 1800, died 1874, steamed down the Elizabeth, accompanied by 2 one-gun gunboats, to engage the wooden fleet of the Federals, consisting of the frigate Congress, 50 guns, and the sloop Cumberland, 30 guns. Both sailing vessels anchored off Newport News, and the steam frigates Minnesota and Roanoke, the sailing frigate St. Lawrence, and several gunboats anchored off Fortress Monroe. Actual firing began about 2 o'clock, when the Merrimac was nearly a mile from the Congress and the Cumberland. Passing the first of these vessels with terrific broadsides, the Merrimac rammed the Cumberland, and then turned her fire again on the Congress, which, in an attempt to escape, ran aground and was there under fire from 3 other Confederate gunboats, which had meanwhile joined the Merrimac. At about 3:30 p.m., the Cumberland, which had been keeping up a heavy fire at the Confederate vessels, sank, with her pennant still flying from the topmast above the waves. Between 4 and 4:30, the Congress, having been raked fore and aft for nearly an hour by the Merrimac, was forced to surrender. While directing a fire of hot shot to burn the Congress, Commodore Buchanan of the Merrimac was severely wounded and was succeeded in command by Lieutenant Catesby apt Roger Jones. The Federal steam frigates Roanoke, St. Lawrence, and Minnesota had all gone aground in their trip from Old Point Comfort toward the scene of battle, and only the Minnesota was near enough, about 1 mile, to take any part in the fight. She was in such shallow water that the Confederate ironclad ram could not get near her at ebb tide, and at about 5 o'clock the Confederates postponed her capture until the next day and anchored off Sewell's Point. The Monitor, under Lieutenant John Lorimer Worden, born 1818, died 1897, had left New York on the morning of March 6. After a dangerous passage in which she twice narrowly escaped sinking, she arrived at Hampton Roads during the night of the 8th, and early in the morning on the 9th anchored near the Minnesota. When the Merrimac advanced to attack the Minnesota, the Monitor went out to meet her, and the battle between the ironclads began at about 9 a.m. on the 9th. Neither vessel was able to seriously injure the other. The Monitor had the advantage of being able to outmaneuver her heavier and more unwieldy adversary, but the revolving turret made firing difficult, and communications were none too good with the pilot house, the position of which on the forward deck lessened the range of the 2 turret guns. The machinery worked so badly that the revolution of the turret was stopped. After 2 hours' fighting, the Monitor was drawn off, so that more ammunition could be placed in the turret. When the battle was renewed, at about 11:30, the Merrimac began firing at the Monitor's pilot house, and a little after noon a shot struck the sight hole of the pilot house and blinded Lieutenant Worden. The Monitor withdrew in the confusion consequent upon the wounding of her commanding officer, and the Merrimac, after a short while for her adversary, steamed back to Norfolk. There were virtually no casualties on either side. After the evacuation of Norfolk by the Confederates on May 9th, Commodore Josiah Tatnall, then in command of the Merrimac, being unable to take her up the James, sank her. The Monitor was lost in a gale off Cape Hatteras on December 31st, 1862. Though the battle between the two vessels was indecisive, its effect was to neutralize the Merrimac, which had caused great alarm in Washington, and to prevent the breaking of the Federal blockade at Hampton Roads. In the history of naval warfare, it may be regarded as making the opening of a new era, the era of the armored warship. On this day in history, March 10th, 1762, French Huguenot Jean Calas, who had been wrongfully convicted of killing his son, dies after being tortured by authorities. The event inspired Voltaire to begin a campaign for religious tolerance and legal reform. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Jean Calas. Jean Calas, born 1698, died 1762, a Protestant merchant at Toulouse, whose legal murder is a celebrated case in French history, was born at La Caparade, near Chartres, on March 19, 1698. His wife was an Englishwoman of French extraction. They had 3 sons and 3 daughters. His son Louis had become a Roman Catholic. In October 1761, another son, Antoine, hanged himself in his father's warehouse. It was alleged that he had been strangled by the family to prevent him from changing his religion, and that this was a common practice among Protestants. The unhappy family were condemned to the rack in order to extort confession. They appealed to the Parliament, but this body sentenced the old father to the torture, ordinary and extraordinary, to be broken alive upon the wheel, and then to be burnt to ashes, which decree was executed on March 9, 1762. Pierre Calas, the surviving son, was banished for life. The rest were acquitted. The distracted widow, however, found some friends, and among them Voltaire, who laid her case before the Council of State at Versailles. For 3 years he worked indefatigably to procure justice and made the Calas case famous throughout Europe. Finally, the king and council annulled the proceeding of the Parliament of Toulouse. Calas was declared to have been innocent, and a payment was made to the family, but no proceedings were taken against the magistrates or the Parliament. On this day in history, March 11, 1848, Louis Hippolyte Lafontaine and Robert Baldwin become the first prime ministers of the province of Canada to be democratically elected under a system of responsible government. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Robert Baldwin. Baldwin, Robert, born 1804, died 1858, Canadian statesman, was born at York, now Toronto, on May 12, 1804. His father, William Warren Baldwin, died 1844, went to Canada from Ireland in 1798. He opposed the religious and political oligarchy which was then at the head of Canadian affairs, and brought up his son in the same principles. Robert Baldwin was called to the bar in 1825 and entered into partnership with his father. In 1829-30 he sat in the Parliament of Upper Canada for the town of York. During the next 6 years, he constantly advocated a responsible executive as the one cure for the political and economic evils of the time. In 1836, he was nominated to the Executive Council, but resigned within a month. Though a reformer, he strongly disapproved of the rebellion of 1837-38. On the union of the two Canadas, he became, 1841, a member of the Executive Council under Lord Sydenham, but soon resigned on the question of responsible government. In 1842, he formed the first Liberal administration in connection with Mr., afterwards Sir, L. H. Lafontaine, but resigned the next year after a quarrel with the Governor-General, Sir Charles Metcalfe, on a question of patronage, in which he felt that a responsible government to be involved. At the general election which followed, the Governor-General was sustained by a narrow majority, but in 1848 the Liberals were again returned to power, and he and Mr. Lafontaine formed their second administration under Lord Elgin, and carried numerous important reforms, including the freeing from sectarian control of the provincial university and introduction into Upper Canada of an important municipal system. Internal dissensions soon began to appear in the Liberal Party, and in 1851 Mr. Baldwin resigned. The special struggle leading to his resignation was an attempt to abolish the Court of Chancery of Upper Canada, whose constitution was due to a measure introduced by Baldwin in 1849. The attempt, though defeated, had been supported by a majority of the representatives from Upper Canada, and Baldwin's fastidious conscience took it as a vote of want of confidence. A deeper reason was his inability to approve of the advanced views of the Radicals, or Clear Grits, as they came to be called. On seeking re-election in York, he declined to give any pledge on the burning question of the clergy reserves, and was defeated. In 1858, the Liberal Conservative Party, formed in 1854 by a coalition, attempted to bring him out as a candidate for the upper house, which was at this date elective. But though he had broken with the advanced reformers, he could not approve of the tactics of their opponents, and refused to stand. He died on December 9th, 1858. After the concession of responsible government, he devoted himself to bringing about a good understanding between the English and French-speaking inhabitants of Canada, and his memory is held as dear among the French Canadians as in his native province of Ontario. On this day in history, March 12, 1088, the election of Urban II as the 159th Pope of the Catholic Church is conducted. He is best known for initiating the Crusades. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Urban II. Urban II, Odo, or Otho, or Eudes de Lagari, Pope from March 12, 1088 to July 29, 1099, was born near Reims, became Archdeacon of Auxerre, and later joined the Congregation of Cluny, where he became sub-prior. He was created Cardinal Bishop of Ostia in 1078 by Gregory VII, to whom he displayed such loyalty, especially as papal legate in Germany, 1084, that he was imprisoned for a time by Henry IV. He was designated by Gregory as one of 4 men most worthy to succeed him, and, after a vacancy of more than 5 months following the decease of Victor III, he was elected Pope on March 12, 1088. By an assembly of cardinals and others at Terracina. Throughout the major part of his pontificate, he had to reckon with the presence of the powerful anti-pope Clement III, Guibert of Ravenna. In Rome, he maintained an alliance with the Norman Duke Roger, Robert Guiscard's son and successor, and united the German with the Italian opposition to the emperor by promoting the marriage of the Countess Matilda with young Welf of Bavaria. He aided Prince Conrad in his rebellion against his father and crowned him King of the Romans at Milan in 1093. By excommunicating Philip I of France for matrimonial infidelity in 1095, Urban opened a struggle which was not terminated until after his death. Invited to Tuscany by Countess Matilda, he invoked a council at Piacenza in March 1095, attended by so vast a number of prelates and laymen that its sessions were held in the open air, and addressed by the ambassadors of Alexis, the Byzantine emperor, who sought aid against the Mussulmans. Urban crossed the Alps in the summer, and remained over a year in France and Burgundy. He held a largely attended council at Clermont in November 1095, where he preached the First Crusade. Crusaders on their way through Italy drove the anti-pope Clement III, finally from Rome in 1097, and established Urban firmly in the Papal See. With a view to facilitating the crusade, a council was held at Bari in October 1098, at which religious differences were debated, and the exiled Anselm of Canterbury combated the Eastern view of the procession of the Holy Ghost. Urban died suddenly at Rome on July 29, 1099, 14 days after the capture of Jerusalem, but before the tidings of that event had reached Italy. His successor was Paschal II. On this day in history, March 13th, 222, Roman Emperor Elagabalus is murdered alongside his mother, Julia Somius. He is replaced by his 14-year-old cousin, Severus Alexander. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the life of Alexander. Alexander Severus, Marcus Aurelius Severus Alexander, born 208, died 235. Roman Emperor from 222 to 235. Was born at Arca Caesarea in Palestine on October 1st, 208. He was the son of an imperial procurator. In 221, his grandmother, Julia Messia, persuaded her nephew, the Emperor Heliogabalus, to adopt him as successor and create him Caesar. In the next year, on March 11th, Heliogabalus was murdered, and Alexander was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian and accepted by the Senate. He was then a mere lad, amiable, well-meaning, but entirely under the dominion of his mother, Julia Mamaea, who surrounded him with wise counselors, but who alienated the army by extreme parsimony, while neither she nor her son had a strong enough hand to keep tight the reins of military discipline. Mutinies became frequent in all parts of the empire. To one of them, the life of the jurist and praetorian prefect, Ulpian, was sacrificed. Another compelled the retirement of Dio Cassius from his command. On the whole, however, the reign of Alexander was prosperous till he was summoned to the east to face the new power of the Sasanians. Of the war that followed we have various accounts. Mommsen leans to that which is least favorable to the Romans. At all events, though the Persians were checked for the time, The conduct of the Roman army showed an extraordinary lack of discipline. The emperor returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph, 233, but next year he was called to face German invaders in Gaul, where he was slain on March 18th or 19th, 235, together with his mother, in a mutiny which was probably led by Maximinus, a Thracian legionary, and at any rate secured him the throne. Alexander was the last of the Syrian princes. His advisors were the famous jurist Ulpian, the historian Dio Cassius, and a select board of 16 senators. A municipal council of 14 assisted the city prefect in administering the affairs of the 14 districts of Rome. The luxury and extravagance that had formerly been so prevalent at the court were put down. The standard of the coinage was raised, taxes were lightened, literature, art, and science were encouraged, the lot of the soldiers was improved, and, for the convenience of the people, loan offices were instituted for loaning money at a moderate rate of interest. In religious matters, Alexander preserved an open mind. In his private chapel he had busts of Orpheus, Abraham, Apollonius of Tyana, and Jesus Christ. On this day in history, March 14th, 1590, as part of the Battle of Ivry, Henry of Navarre and the Huguenots defeat forces of the Catholic League under Charles, Duke of Mayenne, during the French Wars of Religion. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of Ivry, 1590. The Battle of Ivry, France, was fought between the Huguenots under Henry IV of France and the Catholics under the Duke of Mayenne on March 14, 1590. On August 1, 1589, Henry III was assassinated and Henry IV of Navarre ascended the French throne, and at the Battle of Arques, won by him on September 28, 1589, he, through his energy, gallantry, and resourcefulness, established himself as the national hero. The next year, the Duke of Mayenne laid siege to Melun, but fell back on the approach of Henry. No sooner had the king withdrawn than he was recalled to confront Mayenne, who, reinforced by the Spaniards, had returned. The two forces, the duke's numbering about 13,000 and the king's somewhat less, met on the plain of Ivry. The following brief account of the battle, which took place, will give some idea of the desultory tactics in vogue at this time. Henry first drew up his army, prayed, and then adjusted his helmet, on the crest of which floated 3 white plumes. Before lowering his visor, he said to his companions, "I will conquer or die. Keep well your ranks, and if the heat of the battle compels you to leave them, always rally. It is one thing to remember in war. This you should do by the 3 pear trees you see yonder on my right. If you lose your banners and your standards, do not, however, lose sight of my white plume, for you will always find it on the road of honor and pointing towards victory." Colonel Schomberg, a captain of mercenaries, rode up to the king and demanded that his men should be paid. Henry, in a rage, rebuked him, and then throwing his arms about him, kissed him, whereupon Schomberg, with tears in his eyes, replied, "O sire, in giving me back the honor you took from me, you take away my life." The charge was sounded.
Je me pas montrer, foncer l'ennemi comme un lion furieux, et me les armées à la main.
And Schomberg sped forward like an arrow, hurled himself like a furious lion on the enemy, and died, sword in hand. With the shouts of "Vive le Roi!" battalions and squadrons followed with him. The two sides clinched, and for several hours attacks were made and repulsed without any decided advantage being gained. A page bearing a white plume in his helmet being killed, a panic seized upon some of Henry's squadrons. At the moment he was busily engaged in a hand-to-hand fight, lost to sight in a melee. Cutting his way out, his white plumes were once again seen, whereupon his soldiers, wild with joy, charged forward, and the enemy was routed. A pursuit to the bridge of Ivry then followed, at which most of the foreign troops in Mayenne's pay were butchered, the French and Swiss alone receiving quarter. The prestige won at Ivry was Henry's true gain and victory. He was accepted by France, and then, as an act of political wisdom, in July 1593, he became a Catholic, and 2 years later brought about the collapse of all opposition. On this day in history, March 15th, 493, Odoacer, the first barbarian king of Italy after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, is slain by Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, while the two kings were feasting together. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the life of Odoacer. Odoacer, or Odovaker, circa 434 to 493, the first barbarian ruler of Italy, son of Oedeco, or Idico, was born in the district bordering on the Middle Danube about the year 434. He was probably one of the tribe of Scyri who had invaded Pannonia about 430. It is said that as a tall young recruit for the Roman armies, dressed in a sordid vesture of skins, on his way to Italy, he entered the cell of St. Severnius to ask his blessing. The saint had an inward premonition of his future greatness, and in blessing him said, "Fare onward into Italy. Thou art now clothed in vile raiment, wilt soon give precious gifts unto many." Odoacer was probably about 30 years of age when he thus entered the imperial service. By the year 472 he had risen to some eminence. In the year 475 the Emperor Nepos was driven into exile, and the successful rebel Orestes was enabled to array in the purple his son, a handsome boy of 14 or 15, who was named Romulus after his grandfather, and nicknamed Augustulus, from his inability to play the part of the great Augustus. Before this puppet emperor had been a year on the throne, the barbarian mercenaries rose in mutiny, demanding to be made proprietaries of 1/3 of the soil of Italy. To this request Orestes returned a peremptory negative. Odoacer now offered his fellow soldiers to obtain for them all that they desired, if they would seat him on the throne. On August 23, 476, he was proclaimed king. 5 days later, Orestes was made prisoner at Placentia and beheaded. Augustulus was compelled to descend from the throne, but his life was spared. Odoacer was 42 years of age when he thus became chief ruler of Italy, and he reigned 13 years with undisputed sway. The administration was conducted as much as possible on the lines of the old imperial government. The settlement of the barbarian soldiers on the lands of Italy probably affected the great landowners rather than the laboring class. To the herd, or coloni and servi, it probably made little difference whether the master whom they served called himself Roman or Rugian. In 477 or 478, the dethroned Emperor Nepos sent ambassadors to Zeno, Emperor of the East, begging his aid in the reconquest of Italy. These ambassadors met at a deputation from the Roman Senate, sent normally by the command of Augustulus, really no doubt by that of Odoacer, to declare that they did not need a separate emperor. The Senate had chosen Odoacer, and they therefore prayed Zeno to confer upon him the dignity of patrician and entrust the diocese of Italy to his care. Zeno returned a harsh answer to the Senate, requiring them to return to their allegiance to Nepos. In fact, however, he did nothing for the fallen emperor, but accepted the new order of things, and even addressed Odoacer as patrician. On the other hand, the latter sent the arraignments of empire to Constantinople as an acknowledgment of the fact that he did not claim supreme power. Our information as to the actual title assumed by the new ruler is somewhat confused. He does not appear to have called himself king of Italy, but only king of the tribes of barbarians that followed him. By the Roman inhabitants of Italy he was addressed as Dominius Noster, but his right to exercise power would in their eyes rest, in theory, on his recognition as patricius by the Byzantine Augustus. At the same time, he marked his own high pretensions by assuming the prefix Flavius. His internal administration was probably, upon the whole, wise and moderate, and he may be looked upon as a not altogether unworthy predecessor of Theodoric. In the history of the papacy, Odoacer figures as the author of a decree promulgated at the election of Felix II in 483, forbidding the pope to alienate any of the lands or ornaments of the Roman Church, and threatening any pope who should infringe this edict with anathema. The chief events in the foreign policy of Odoacer were his Dalmatian and Rugian wars. In the year 480, the ex-ambassador Nepos, who ruled Dalmatia, was traitorously assassinated in Diocletian's palace at Spalato by the Counts Viator and Ovida. In the following year, Odoacer invaded Dalmatia, slew the murderer Ovida, and re-annexed Dalmatia to the western state. In 487, he appeared as an invader in his own native Danubian lands. War broke out between him and Philethus, king of the Rugians. Odoacer entered Rugian territory and defeated and captured Philethus. In the following year, Frederick, son of the captive king, endeavored to raise again the fallen fortunes of his house, but was defeated by Onulf, brother of Odoacer. and took refuge at the court of Theodoric the Ostrogoth. This Rugian war was probably an indirect cause of the fall of Odoacer. His increasing power rendered him too formidable to the Byzantine court. At the same time, Zeno was embarrassed by the formidable neighborhood of Theodoric the Ostrogoth. In these circumstances arose the plan of Theodoric's invasion of Italy, the details of which belong properly to the life of Theodoric. It is sufficient to state here that he entered Italy in August 489, defeated Odoacer at Isonzo on the 28th of August, and at Verona on the 30th of September. Odoacer then shut himself up in Ravenna, and there maintained himself for 4 years, with one brief gleam of success, during which he emerged from his hiding place and fought the Battle of the Adua, August 11th, 490, in which he was again defeated. A sally from Ravenna, July 10th, 491, was again the occasion of a murderous defeat. At length, the famine in Ravenna having become almost intolerable, and the Goths despairing of ever taking the city by assault, negotiations were opened for a compromise. February 25th, 493. It was stipulated that Ravenna should be surrendered, that Odoacer's life should be spared, and that he and Theodoric should be recognized as joint rulers of the Roman state. The arrangement was evidently a precarious one, and was soon terminated by the treachery of Theodoric. He invited his rival to a banquet in the palace of Lauretum on the 15th of March, and there slew him with his own hand. "Where is God?" cried Odoacer, when he perceived the ambush into which he had fallen. "Thus didst thou deal with my kinsman," shouted Theodoric, and clove his rival with the broadsword from shoulder to flank. Thelin, his son, was not long after put to death by order of the conqueror. Thus perished the whole race of Odoacer. On this day in history, March 16th, 1696, the Dutch bombard Givet during the 9 Years' War. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the town of Givet. Givet, town of northern France, in the department of Ardennes, 40 miles north by east of Mézières, on the eastern railway between the town and Namur. Population of 1936, 6,583. Commune, 6,923. Givet lies on the Meuse near the Belgian frontier, and was formerly an important fortress. It is divided into 3 portions: the citadel, called Charlemont, and Grand Givet on the left bank of the river, and on the opposite bank, Petit Givet. The fortress, the only survival of the fortifications, at the top of a precipitous rock 705 feet high, was founded by the Emperor Charles V in the 16th century, and further fortified by Vauban at the end of the 17th century. It is the only survival of the fortifications of the town, the rest of which were destroyed in 1892. In Grand Givet there are a church and a town hall built by Vauban, and a statue of the composer, Étienne Méhul, stands in the fine square named after him. Petit Givet, the industrial quarter, is traversed by tanneries and glue factories. Pencils and tobacco pipes are also manufactured. The town has considerable river traffic, consisting chiefly of coal, copper, and stone. There is a chamber of arts and manufactures. On this day in history, March 17th, 45 BC, in his last victory, Julius Caesar defeats the Pompeian forces of Titus Labienus and Pompey the Younger in the Battle of Munda. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the battle. Battle of Munda, 45 BC. While Caesar was campaigning in Africa, Pompey's cause was revived in Spain by his sons Gnaeus and Sextus, who had recruited a large army. From Africa, Caesar returned to Rome, and towards the end of 46 BC once again proceeded to Spain, where he suffered a reverse on the river Baetis. But worsting Gnaeus Pompey at Sorcaria, that general retreated southwards towards Carteia. Caesar, however, headed him off and forced him to retrace his steps to Munda. The site of Munda is undecided. Some historians consider that it is the same as modern Monda, but the description of the battle renders this unlikely. It is probably north of the river Singolas, in the neighborhood of Montilla. The town of Munda was situated on a hill, and under its walls Pompey camped on March 15th, 45 BC. The next day, Caesar arrived and entrenched a camp near a small stream some 5 miles away. On the 17th, learning that Pompey had been standing in battle array for some time, he ordered his standards to be raised. The two camps were separated by an undulating plain traversed by a stream, and on this plain and behind the stream Caesar marshaled his army, hoping that Pompey would come down from the hill of Munda and fight him in the open. Pompey was in command of some 50,000 men. His position was exceptionally strong, for any attack on him would have been made uphill and over marshy ground. Caesar's army numbered some 40,000, and as Pompey refused to come down from the hill he advanced towards him. On reaching the stream he halted his line, and pointed out to his officers the disadvantage of attacking uphill. This becoming known to men, considerable insubordination was displayed, as they felt certain of victory. Caesar thereupon ordered the advance to be continued. This halt, however, had induced Pompey to believe that Caesar had hesitated through fear, which was the case, and, plucking up courage, he moved his line down the hill, but not so far from Munda that he could not retire to it if defeated. When the lines met, the greatest enthusiasm was shown on both sides. Caesar's legions, charging up the hill with great gallantry, were met by a storm of pila, javelins. Pompey's men, remembering the terrible slaughter at Thapsus, fought with determination and fury. The flight of javelins was followed by a charge which struck Caesar's front like a ram and staggered his line. The clinch then took place, and little by little Caesar's cohorts were pushed back. The situation now became extremely critical, for Caesar was some 5 miles from his camp, and should his line break, annihilation must follow. Seizing a sword and a shield, he rushed forward in the front rank before the ensigns, and by his personal example stimulated the morale of his men. As evening approached, both sides had exhausted their reserves. The auxiliaries had left the field. There was no chance of maneuvering except by cavalry, and though both sides had a considerable number of horsemen, apparently no such maneuver was made. Very few Roman generals ever understood the use of this arm. At length, as the situation became still more critical, Caesar turned to the veteran 10th Legion and cried, "Are you not ashamed to deliver your general into the hands of boys?" Stung by this taunt, the 10th Legion once again charged forward, driving back Pompey's left and compelling him to draw on his right in order to reinforce it. Caesar's cavalry then fell upon the weakened right wing, which was badly shaken. This apparently stimulated Caesar's Numidian cavalry into action, for they moved round this wing, dispatched 5 cohorts to head them off. This rearwards movement was mistaken by the Pompeian army as a general withdrawal. Thereupon the line broke and fell back on Munda in confusion. At last Caesar's 8,000 horsemen were launched, and 30,000 of the enemy were slaughtered. Caesar's losses were 1,000 killed and 500 wounded. On this day in history, March 18th, 37 AD, the Roman Senate annuls Tiberius's will and proclaims Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, aka Caligula, or Little Boots, emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Caligula. Caligula, Gaius Caesar, born 21 AD, died 41, Roman emperor from 37 to 41 AD, youngest son of Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, was born on August 31st, 12 AD. He grew up in his father's camp among the soldiers and was called Caligula from caligae, or soldier's boots, which he used to wear. He accompanied his father to Syria, and after his death returned to Rome. In 32 he was summoned by Tiberius to Caprae, and by skillful flattery managed to escape the fate of his relatives. After the death of Tiberius, mysterious no doubt, but by no means certainly a murder, Caligula succeeded to the exclusion of Tiberius Gemellus, son of Drusus. The traditional account shows him received with rejoicing, and for 8 months delighting everybody by general concessions, and in particular by reversing Tiberius's policy. Then, apparently, he had a very severe illness, and for the rest of his life was the usual monster of cruelty and vice with whom we become so familiar in the history of the Roman emperors, with a few added extravagances, such as bestowing the consulship on his horse, that seem only explicable on the ground of madness. In the case of a good many emperors, there is some material whereby we can discount some of the excesses of senatorial history. In Caligula's, very little. This much is clear. Caligula is the earliest of a tradition that eventually prevailed, the pioneer of the Oriental type of monarchy. His upbringing tended that way. He was brought up by his grandmother Antonia, and Herod Agrippa was a frequent visitor. Hence his insistence on personal deification. the extravagant honors paid to the imperial family, the increasing importance of the women of the palace, but his anti-Roman tendencies, which made him, perhaps even more than his cruelties, an abomination to the senatorial class which furnished the histories of the time, produced effects favorable to the provinces. The strictness with which Augustus and Tiberius kept the citizenship closed was relaxed. We find provincial equites growing numerous, provincial senators even. He also reversed the policy of Tiberius towards Eastern religions, and rebuilt the temple of Isis that Tiberius had destroyed. Caligula's reign was undisturbed externally. There is only the abortive expedition to the coast opposite Britain. He was murdered by Caius Carrea, a tribune in the guard, on January 24th, 41. That he was the savage tyrant that he appeared to senatorial Rome seems probable, in spite of attempts at rehabilitation. It is a pity, however, that there is not more to show whether he was not, in other directions, something more. On this day in history, March 19th, 1284, the Statute of Rhuddlan incorporates the Principality of Wales into England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the conquest of Wales. The English conquest. In both his wars with Llewellyn the Last, Edward had won his victory by the use of sea power against Gwynedd. He had realized that it was only thus that Wales could be crippled, namely by a final blow at the vulnerable danger spot. The dynasty was disposed of by the execution of David, Llewellyn's brother, in 1283. But it was in quite a limited sense that Wales was conquered at this time. Llewellyn's dominions were brought by the Statute of Rhuddlan, 1284, under the direct rule of the Crown. They were divided into counties, furnished with Crown officials, and protected by new castles and boroughs at Carnarvon, Conway, Balmerus, Criccieth, and Harlech. But the old Marcher lordships, baronial preserves where the lords ruled as little kings and royal writs did not run, were not interfered with. Indeed, their number was increased and new franchises arose around Daneby, Ruthin, Wrexham, and Chirk. Even the loyalist princes of Powys and the Vale of Towy were left undisturbed, and among the smaller Welsh landowners the changes were far fewer than might have been supposed. Indeed, in many respects the new Wales differed little from the old. It was still a land of small, independent states, which each governed by its own customs and inhabited by a Welsh-speaking population, among which the old Welsh culture flourished. Edward was no friend to Marcher privileges. In 1291 he brought the lords Brecknock and Glamorgan to book for exercising the right of private war, and in 1301 he revived the Principality of Wales in the person of his son, seemingly in order to create a Welsh authority which could bridle the barons. But tradition was more potent than royal will. Under the weak rule of Edward II, Wales became the battleground of baronial factions, and when Edward III, in 1343, again created a Prince of Wales, it was with a less ambitious purpose. The Black Prince was hardly more than a chief Welsh landlord, the master of Welsh archers and lancemen, who fought with distinction under him at Crecy and Poitiers. There had been revolts of the Welsh under Rhys ap Mardud of Draislin, 1287, Madag ap Llewellyn of Marianid, 1294, and Llewellyn Bren of Seganid, 1316, but in the course of the 14th century resistance died down. Even Anglesey, that ancient focus of liberty, produced defenders of the crown, such as the Penmynd family, ancestors of the Tudors, and Sir Howell of the Horseshoes, men who never forgave the murderers of Edward II. The country was growing more prosperous, and a thriving trade sprang up at the ports of Rhuddlan, Balmerus, Havenfordwest, and Carmarthen. It is therefore startling to find that, at the opening of the 15th century, Wales convulsed by a new revolt, more widespread than any of its predecessors. Owain Glyndwr was the direct male representative of the line of Northern Powys, which claims that through his mother to the lands of the Lord Rhys. At the accession of Henry IV, he held a portion of this inheritance on the banks of the Dee and of the Teifi. When in 1400 he broke into rebellion, it was mainly to vindicate personal wrongs, but Henry underestimated both the hereditary prestige and the high abilities of this warrior of courage and genius, with the result that Owen's power grew from year to year, and he was ere long emboldened to proclaim himself independent Prince of Wales. The capture of his enemy Reginald Grey gave him financial resources, that of Edward Mortimer, a valuable ally. He concluded a treaty with Charles VI of France, won the castles of Harlech and Aberystwyth, held parliaments of his subjects, and exercised in a large part of Wales the powers of a ruling prince. The downfall of his friends, the Percys, at Shrewsbury, 1403, was not fatal to the movement. More serious was the failure of the French at Woodbury Hill, 1405, and the loss of two castles, 1408. As the difficulties of Henry IV gradually disappeared, Owain's cause became hopeless, and he died in hiding in 1416. He has never ceased to be the darling hero of Welsh popular tradition. The Glyndŵr movement left Welsh society in ruins, and during the rest of the century recovery was but slow. Disorder returned with the Wars of the Roses, in which Welshmen such as Owen Tudor, died 1461, and William Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, died 1469, were deeply involved. It was a Tudor who at last brought peace alike to England and Wales on the field of Bosworth, with a large Welsh following who reckoned that they had avenged in this victory the wrongs of foreign rule. On this day in history, March 20th, 1600, the Linköping bloodbath takes place on Maundy Thursday in Linköping, Sweden. 5 Swedish noblemen are publicly beheaded in the aftermath of the war against Sigismund, 1598 to 1599. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town of Linköping. Linköping, a city of Sweden, the seat of a bishop, and a chief town of the district of Östergötland. Population from 1943, 43,463. Linköping was a bishop's see in 1082, and it was at a council held in the town in 1153 that the payment of Peter's pence was agreed to at the instigation of Nicholas Breakspear, afterwards Adrian IV. The coronation of Birger Jarlsson Valdemar took place in the cathedral in 1251, and in the reign of Gustavus Vasa, several important diets were held in the town. It is situated 142 miles by rail southwest of Stockholm, and communicates with Lake Roxen, half a mile to the north, and the Gotha and Kinda canals by means of navigable stanga. The cathedral, 1150 to 1499, is a Romanesque building with a beautiful south portal and a Gothic choir. It contains an altarpiece by Martin Heemskirk, died 1574. In the Church of St. Lars are some paintings by Per Horberg, 1746 to 1816, the Swedish peasant artist. Other buildings of note are the Episcopal Palace, 1470 to 1500, afterwards a royal palace, and the old gymnasium founded by Gustavus Adolphus in 1627, which contains a valuable library of old books and manuscripts and a museum. There is also the Östergötland Museum. The town has manufactures of tobacco, cloth, and hosiery. On this day in history, March 21st, 1800, with the church leadership driven out of Rome during an armed conflict, Pius VII is crowned Pope in Venice with a temporary papal tiara made of papier-mâché. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the life of Pius. Pius VII, Luigi Bernardo Chiaramonti, Pope from 1800 to 1823. The son of Count Scipion Chiaramonti and the deeply religious Countess Gini, was born at Cesena on August 14, 1740, not 1742. He entered the Benedictine monastery of St. Mary at Cesena and held various teaching appointments in the colleges of his order at Parma and at Rome. He was created an abbot of his order by his relative Pius VI, who also appointed him Bishop of Tivoli in 1782 and raised him to a cardinalate and the see of Imola in 1785. He became Pope on March 14, 1800. His attention was at once directed to the ecclesiastical anarchy of France, and he negotiated the celebrated Concordat of 1801. The importance of this agreement was, however, considerably lessened by the Articles Organiques, appended to it by the French government on April 8, 1802. In 1804, Napoleon opened negotiations to secure at the Pope's hands his formal consecration as emperor. After some hesitation, Pius was induced to perform the ceremony at Notre Dame and to extend his visit to Paris for 4 months. But in return for these favors, he was able to obtain from Napoleon merely 1 or 2 minor concessions. Napoleon soon began to disregard the Italian Concordat of 1803, and himself decreed the dissolution of marriage of his brother Jerome with Miss Patterson of Baltimore. The irritation between France and the Vatican increased so rapidly that on February 2, 1808, Rome was occupied by General Melois. A month later, the provinces of Ancona, Macerata, Fermo, and Urbino were united to the Kingdom of Italy, and diplomatic relations between Napoleon and Rome were broken off. Finally, by a decree issued from Schönbrunn on May 17, 1809, the emperor united the Papal States to France. Pius retaliated by a bull excommunicating the invaders, and to prevent insurrection, Melois, either on his own responsibility, as Napoleon afterwards asserted, or by order of the latter, employed General Radet to take possession of the Pope's person. On July 5th, Pius was made prisoner. He was taken to Grenoble, and then to Savona, where he steadfastly refused canonical institution to the bishops nominated by Napoleon. In 1812, the aged and sick pontiff was removed to Fontainebleau, where he was lodged in a suite of regal magnificence, to await the return of the emperor from Moscow. When Napoleon arrived, he entered into personal negotiations with the Pope, who, on January 25, 1813, assented to a concordance so degrading that his conscience found no relief until, on the advice of the Cardinal Pacca and Consalvi, he abrogated it, March 24th. And on the 9th of May, he defied the emperor by declaring invalid all the official acts of the new French bishops. Napoleon went back to Savona for safekeeping, but the course of events in 1814 forced him to liberate the Pope and give back the states to the Church. On the 19th of March, Pius left Savona, and was received with rejoicing at Rome on May 24th. Reaction set in at Rome. The Jesuits were restored. The French legislation, much of which was of great social value, was repealed. The Index and the Inquisition were revived. On his return from the Congress of Vienna, Consalvi conducted a more enlightened and highly centralized administration based largely on the famous motu proprio of 1816. Nevertheless, the finances were in a desperate condition. Discontent centralized perhaps in the Carbonari, a liberal secret society condemned by the Pope in 1821. Consalvi negotiated a series of valuable concordants with all the Roman Catholic powers save Austria. In the latter years of Pius's life, royalty often came to Rome. The Pope was very gracious to exiled kings and showed notable magnanimity toward the family of Napoleon. He attracted many artists to the city, including the greatest sculptors of the time, one of whom, the Protestant Thorvaldsen, prepared the tomb in which reposed the remains of the gentle and courageous pontiff, who passed into rest on August 20th, 1823. His successor was Leo XII. On this day in history, March 22nd, 1508, Ferdinand II of Aragon commissions Amerigo Vespucci chief navigator of the Spanish Empire. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the life of Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci, born 1451, died 1512, merchant and adventurer, who gave his name of Amerigo to the New World as America, was born at Florence on March 9, 1451. His father, Anastasio Vespucci, was a notary, and his uncle, Fra Giorgio Antonio Vespucci, to whom he owed his education, was a scholarly Dominican and a friend of Savonarola. Amerigo was placed as a clerk in the great commercial house of the Medici, then the ruling family in Florence. A letter of December 30th, 1492, shows that he was then in Seville, and till January 12th, 1496, he seems to have usually resided in Spain, especially at Seville and Cadiz, probably as an agent of the Medici. In December 1495, on the death of a Florentine merchant, Gianetto Berardi, established at Seville, who had fitted out the second expedition of Columbus in 1493, and had also undertaken to fit out 12 ships for the King of Spain, April 9, 1495, Vespucci was commissioned to complete the contract. As Ferdinand recalled the monopoly conceded to Columbus, this order of April 10, 1495 was cancelled on June 2, 1497. Private exploring now had an opportunity, and adventurers of all kinds were able to leave Spain for the West. Vespucci claims to have sailed with one of these freelance expeditions from Cadiz on May 10, 1497. Touching at Grand Canary on the way, the 4 vessels he accompanied going 37 days on a west-southwest course and making 1,000 leagues, are said to have reached a supposed continental coast in 16 degrees north, 70 degrees west, from Grand Canary, June 16, 1497. This should have brought them into the Pacific. They sailed along the coast, says Vespucci, for 80 leagues to the province of Parai, or Lariab, and then 870 leagues more, always to the northwest, to the finest harbor in the world, which, from this description, should be in British Columbia, or thereabouts, thence 100 leagues more to the north and northeast, to the islands of the people called Iti, from which they returned to Spain, reaching Cadiz in October 1498. Still following Vespucci's own statement, he, in May 1499, started on a second voyage of 3 ships under Alonso de Ojeda. Sailing southwest over 500 leagues, they crossed the ocean in 44 days, finding land in 5 degrees south. Thence, encountering various adventures, they worked up to 15 degrees north, and returned to Spain by way of Antigua, Española San Domingo, reaching Cadiz in September 1500. Entering the service of Dom Manuel of Portugal, Vespucci claims to have taken part in a third American expedition, which left Lisbon in May 1501. Vespucci has given 2 accounts of this alleged third voyage, differing in many details, especially dates and distances. From Portugal, he declares that he sailed to Bezaguich, Cape Verde, and thence southwest for 700 leagues, reaching the American coast in 5 degrees south on the 7th or 17th of August. Thence eastward for 300 or 150 leagues, and south and west to 52 degrees south, or 73 degrees 30 minutes. In his own words, 13 degrees from the Arctic Pole, i.e., well into the Arctic continent. He returned, he adds, by Sierra Leone, June 10th, and the Azores, end of July, to Lisbon, September 7th, 1502. His second Portuguese and fourth and last American voyage was alleged by him was destined for Malacca, which he supposed to be in 33 degrees south, really in 2 degrees 14 minutes north. Starting from Lisbon on May 10, 1503, with a fleet of 6 ships, and reaching Bahia by way of Fernando Noronha, unknown, Vespucci declares that he built a fort at a harbor in 18 degrees south, and thence returned to Lisbon, June 18, 1504. In February 1505, being again in Spain, he visited Christopher Columbus, who entrusted him a letter to his own Diego. On April 24, 1505, Vespucci received Spanish letters of naturalization, and in 1508 he was appointed Piloto Mayor, or Chief Pilot of Spain, an office which he held till his death at Seville on February 22, 1512. If his own account had been trustworthy, it would have followed that Vespucci reached the mainland of America 8 days before John Cabot, June 16th against June 24th, 1497. But Vespucci's own statement of his exploring achievements hardly carries conviction. The statement is contained in his letter from Lisbon, March or April 1503, to Lorenzo Piero Francisco de Medici, the head of the firm under which his business career had been mostly spent, describing the alleged Portuguese voyage of March 1501 to September 1502. The original Italian text is lost, but we possess the Latin translation by Jocundus Interpreter, perhaps Giocondo, who brought his invitation to Portugal in 1501. The letter was printed, in some 9 editions, after it was written, the first 2 issues, Mundus Novus and Ispatola Alberdici de Novo Mundo, without place or date appearing before 1504, the 3rd of 1504, Mundus Novus, at Augsburg. 2 very early Paris editions are also known, and one Strasbourg, De Ora Antarctica, 1505, edited by E. Ringman. It was also included in the Paesi Nuovamente Retrovati of 1507, Vicenza, under the title of Novo Mondo da al Vesputio. The connection of the New World with Vespucci, thus expressed, is derived from the argument of this first letter, that it was right to call Amerigo's discovery a New World, because it had not been seen before by anyone. This prepared the way for the American names soon given to the continent. In Vespucci's letter, also written from Portugal, September 1504, and probably addressed to his old schoolfellow Piero Soderini, Gonfalonieri of Florence, 1502 to 1512, from the Italian original, of which 4 printed copies still exist without place or date, but probably before 1507, a French version was made, and from the latter a Latin translation, published at St. Die in Lorraine in April 1507, and immediately made use in the Cosmographe Introductio, St. Die 1507, of Martin Waldesmuller, Hylicomulus, professor of cosmography in St. Die University. Here we have perhaps the first suggestion in a printed book that the newly discovered fourth part of the world should be called America, since Alexander von Humboldt discussed the subject in his Examen critique de la histoire de la géographie du Nouveau Continent, 1837, volume 4, the general weight of opinion, in spite of F.A. de Varnhagen, Amerigo Vespucci, son caricature ses escrits, Savaille, Lima, 1865, and other pro-Vespuccian works, has been that Vespucci did not make the 1497 voyage, and that he had no share in the first discovery of the American continent. On this day in history, March 23, 1540, Waltham Abbey is surrendered to King Henry VIII of England, the last religious community to be closed during the dissolution of the monasteries. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the Abbey. Waltham Abbey, or Waltham Holy Cross, a market town and urban district in Essex, England, on the Lee and on the Cambridge branch of LNER. Population, 1938 estimated, 7,164. Area, 17.1 square miles. Of the former magnificent cruciform abbey church, the only portion of importance now remaining is the nave, forming the present parish church, the 2 easternmost bays being converted into the chancel. It is a very fine specimen of ornate Norman. On the south side is a lady chapel containing some good decorated work, with a crypt below, thought to date from circa 1316. Of the monastic building there remain only a bridge and gateway, and other slight fragments. At Waltham Cross, about 1 mile west of Waltham in Hertfordshire, is the beautiful cross erected, 1291-94, by Edward I at one of the resting places of the corpse of Queen Eleanor, on its way to burial in Westminster Abbey. The Royal Gunpowder Factory is in the immediate vicinity. Government works were built in 1890 at Quinton Hill, half a mile west of the town, for the manufacture of cordite, and the town possesses gun cotton and percussion cap factories, flour mills, malt kilns, and breweries, besides light industries. Watercress is extensively grown in the neighborhood, and there are market gardens and nurseries. On this day in history, March 24th, 1387, an English victory over a Franco-Castilian Flemish fleet in the Battle of Margate off the coast of Margate is completed. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of the town of Margate. Margate, a municipal borough and seaside resort in the Isle of Thanet, parliamentary division of Kent, England, 74 miles southeast of London by rail. Population, from 1938, 39,470. Area, 10.9 square miles. Margate, on the north coast of Thanet, was an ancient and senior non-corporate member of Dover. In 1347, it contributed 15 ships of small tonnage at the time of the siege of Calais. A pier existed before 1500, but by the reign of Henry VIII, it was in a decayed condition. The amount of corn shipped was small, the droits being insufficient to keep the pier in repair. Under Elizabeth, Margate was still an obscure fishing village employing about 20 small vessels, hoys, in the coasting and river trades, on which in 1791 it chiefly subsisted. In 1777 the pier was rebuilt, and about this time Margate first began to be known as a bathing place. In 1835 it was still a liberty of Dover, and no right of citizenship would be acquired. In 1857 it was incorporated. In 1935 the borough was extended to include the neighboring resorts of Westgate-on-Sea and Birchington. It is practically contiguous with Broadstairs on the southeast, and during the season is served by pleasure steamers from London. The municipality owns over 8 miles of seafront, with promenades along almost the whole distance. Many works to improve the 3 resorts were undertaken, and Northdown Park, 38.5 acres, was purchased as a public park. Margate suffered considerably, however, from air raids in World War II. 8,000 houses having been damaged in 1940 to 41. A pier constructed in 1815 is now chiefly used by fishermen and colliers. The Church of St. John the Baptist, founded in 1050, contains some portions of Norman architecture, the remainder being decorated and perpendicular. The manor house of Dunderlane, or Dent de Lion, with its early 15th century gateway, remains between Margate and Westgate. During the widening of the Minster Road in 1922, an Anglo-Saxon cemetery was discovered. On this day in history, March 25th, 717, Theodosius III resigns the throne to the Byzantine Empire to enter the clergy, allowing Leo III to take the throne and begin the Isaurian dynasty. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Leo III. Leo III, circa 680 to 740, called the Isaurian, Emperor of the East from 717 to 740. Born about 680 in the Syrian province of Kamagani, he rose to distinction in the military service and under Anastasius II was invested with the command of the Eastern Army. In 717 he revolted against the usurper Theodosius III and, marching upon Constantinople, was elected emperor in his stead. The first year of Leo's reign saw a memorable siege of his capital by the Saracens, who had taken advantage of the civil discord in the Roman Empire to bring up a force of 80,000 men to the Bosphorus. By his stubborn defense, the new ruler wore out the invaders who, after 12 months' investment, withdrew their forces. An important factor in the victory of the Romans was their use of Greek fire. Having thus preserved the empire from extinction, Leo proceeded to consolidate its administration, which in the previous years of anarchy had become completely disorganized. He secured its frontiers by inviting Slavonic settlers into the depopulated districts and by restoring the army to efficiency. When the Arabs renewed their invasions in 726 and 739, they were decisively beaten on both occasions by the imperial forces. His civil reforms include the abolition of the system of prepaying taxes which had weighed heavily upon the wealthier proprietors, the elevation of the serfs into a class of free tenants, the remodeling of family and of maritime law. These measures, which were embodied in a new code published in 740, met with some opposition on the part of the nobles and the higher clergy, but Leo's most striking legislative reforms dealt with the religious matters. After an apparently successful attempt to enforce the baptism of all Jews and Montanus in his realm, 722, he issued a series of edicts against the worship of images, 726 to 729. This prohibition of a custom, which had undoubtedly given rise to grave abuses, seems to have been inspired by a genuine desire to improve public morality, and received the support of the official aristocracy and a section of the clergy. But a majority of the theologians and all the monks opposed these measures with uncompromising hostility, and in western parts of the empire people refused to obey the edict. A revolt which broke out in Greece, mainly on religious grounds, was crushed by the imperial fleet in 727, and 2 years later, by deposing the Patriarch of Constantinople, Leo suppressed the overt opposition of the capital. In Italy, the defiant attitude of Pope Gregory II and III on behalf of image worship led to a fierce quarrel with the emperor. The former summoned councils in Rome to anathematize and excommunicate the image breakers, 730-732. Leo retaliated by transferring southern Italy and Greece from the papal diocese to that of the Patriarch. The struggle was accompanied by an armed outbreak in the exarchate of Ravenna, 727. Which Leo finally endeavored to subdue by means of a large fleet. But the destruction of the armament by a storm decided the issue against him. His South Italian subjects successfully defied his religious edicts, and the province of Ravenna became detached from the empire. In spite of this partial failure, Leo must be reckoned as one of the greatest of the later Roman emperors. By his resolute stand against the Saracens, he delivered all Eastern Europe from a great danger, and by his thoroughgoing reforms, he not only saved the empire from collapse, but invested it with a stability which enabled it to survive all further shocks for a space of 5 centuries. On this day in history, March 26, 1027, Pope John XIX crowns Conrad II as Holy Roman Emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Conrad. Conrad II, born circa 1990, died 1039, Roman Emperor, son of Henry, Count of Spires, and a descendant of Emperor Otto the Great. He founded the Salian or Franconian imperial dynasty. After a contest with a younger member of his family, and in the face of much opposition on the part of the Polish and Burgundian kings and the Duke of Swabia, Conrad was finally crowned at Rome on March 26, 1027. He did much to establish the imperial authority in Italy. He had been crowned with the Iron Crown of Lombardy in 1026, and might have done more if he had not had to face continual revolts among the German princes. He was very successful in crushing these outbreaks, and he left Germany far stronger and greater in territory than he found it. He sought to establish the hereditary principle in Italy, and in a lesser degree in Germany, and to unite the two countries by marriage ties. His ecclesiastical policy was firm and autocratic, and he substituted Justinian's code in Lombardy for the old Lombard laws. He died at Utrecht on June 4, 1039, and was buried in the cathedral he had begun to build at Spires. On this day in history, March 27, 1809, as part of the Peninsular War, a combined Franco-Polish force defeats the Spanish in the Battle of Ciudad Real. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Ciudad Real. Ciudad Real, a town of central Spain, capital formerly of La Mancha and after 1833 of the province described above. It lies 107 miles south of Madrid, on the Madrid-Badajoz-Lisbon and Ciudad Real Manzanares railways. Population, from 1940, 33,363. Ciudad Real, and its tributary, the Jabalon on the south, offers little of interest beyond its lofty Gothic cathedral built without aisles. It is the market for the cereals, oil, wine, potatoes, and figs produced with irrigation on the surrounding plain. Ciudad Real was founded by Alfonso X of Castile, 1852-84, and fortified by him as a check upon the Moorish power. Its original name of Villa Real was changed to Ciudad Real by John VI in 1420. It is said to have suffered greatly, especially in the loss of its flourishing leather industry, by the expulsion of the Moriscos in the 17th century. During the Peninsular War, a Spanish force was defeated here by the French on March 27, 1809. On this day in history, March 28, 193, after assassinating the Roman Emperor Pertinax, the Praetorian Guards auction off the throne to Didius Julianus. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Didius. Marcus Didius Salvius Julianus, Roman Emperor for 2 months, March 28th to June 2nd, 193 AD. He was the grandson of Salvius Julianus, a famous jurist under Hadrian and the Antonines, and the son of a distinguished general. On the death of Pertinax, the Praetorian Guards offered the throne to the highest bidder. Didius and Sulpicianus, prefect of the city, bid against each other, and finally the throne was knocked down to Didius. The Senate and nobles professed their loyalty, but the people made no attempt to conceal their indignation at this insult to the state, and the armies of Britain, Syria, and Illyricum revolted. Septimus Severus, the commander of the Pannonian legions, was declared emperor and hastened to Italy. Didius, abandoned by the Praetorians, was condemned and executed by order of the state, which at once acknowledged Severus. On this day in history, March 29th, 1461, the Battle of Towton occurs. Edward of York defeats Queen Margaret to become King Edward IV of England, bringing a temporary stop to the War of the Roses. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Towton. Towton, a village in the West Riding of Yorkshire, England, 2.5 miles south of Tadcaster, the scene of a battle fought March 29, 1461, between the armies of York and Lancaster. The party of Lancaster had won the Battle of St. Albans, but, unable to gain admission into London, and threatened by the approach of Edward, the young Duke of York, from the west of England, was compelled to fall back northward. York, having been proclaimed as Edward IV, followed them up into Yorkshire, and on the 27th his leading troops surprised the passage of the air at Ferrybridge. The Lancasterians were encamped at Towton, some miles away, covering Tadcaster and York. But a force under Lord Clifford was promptly set out, recaptured Ferrybridge by surprise, and cut to pieces the Yorkist garrison. About the same time, however, Edward's van, under Lord Falconberg, an experienced soldier, crossed the air higher up, and Clifford was compelled to retire. He was closely pressed, and at Dintingdale, within a few furlongs of his own camps, was cut off and killed with nearly all his men. Edward's main body was now close at hand, and the Lancastrians drew up on their chosen battlefield early on the 29th. This field was an elevated plateau, with steep slopes between the present Great North Road and the River Cock, cut in two by a depression called Towton Dale. On opposite sides of this depression stood the two armies, that of York facing north, their opponents southward. Both lines of battle were very dense. On a front of little more than 1,000 yards, the Lancastrian party had nearly 60,000 men. Edward's force, less than 50,000, was not at all present, the rear battle under Norfolk being still distant. Snow and sleet blew in the faces of the Lancastrians and covered the field of battle. The skillful Falkenberg used this advantage to the utmost. Aided by the wind, his archers discharged flights of arrows against the enemy, who replied blindly and feebly, hampered by snow and wind. The Yorkists withdrew until the enemy had exhausted their quivers, and then advanced afresh. Their arrows soon stung the Lancastrians into a wild and disorderly charge. Suffering severe losses, the latter closed with Edward's line of battle. No quarter was given by either party, and on the narrow front, the numerical superiority of the Lancastrians counted for little. The long, doubtful, and sanguinary struggle was only decided by the arrival of Norfolk's corps, which charged the enemy in flank. Driven backwards and upwards, the Lancastrians were in a desperate position, for their only way of escape to Tadcaster crossed the swollen waters of the Cock by a single narrow and difficult ford, and when, after a stubborn struggle, they finally broke and fled, they were slaughtered in thousands as they tried to cross. At the close of the day, the defeated army had ceased to exist. 25,000 Lancastrian and 8,000 Yorkist dead were buried in and about Towton. On this day in history, March 30th, 1822, the Florida Territory is created in the United States. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the cession of the territory. The westward expansion of the United States made it highly desirable to have American ports on the Gulf of Mexico. Consequently, the acquisition of West Florida, as well as of New Orleans, was one of the aims of the negotiations which resulted in the purchase of Louisiana in 1803. After the cession of Louisiana to the United States, the people of West Florida feared that the province would be seized by Napoleon. They, therefore, through a convention at Bueller's Plains, July 17, 1810, formulated plans for a more effective government. When it was found that the Spanish governor did not accept these plans in good faith, another convention was held on September 26th, which declared West Florida to be an independent state, organized a government, and petitioned for admission to the Union. On October 27th, President James Madison, acting on a theory of Robert R. Livingston that West Florida was ceded by Spain to France in 1800, along with Louisiana, and was therefore included by France in the sale of Louisiana to the United States in 1803, declared West Florida to be under jurisdiction of the United States. 2 years later, the American Congress annexed a portion of West Florida, between the Pearl and Mississippi rivers, to Louisiana, hence the so-called Florida parishes of Louisiana, and that between the Pearl and the Perdido to the Mississippi Territory. In the meantime, war between Great Britain and the United States was imminent. The American government asked the Spanish authorities of East Florida to permit an American occupation of the country in order that it might not be seized by Great Britain and made a base of military operations. When the request was refused, American forces seized Fernandina in the spring of 1812, an action that was repudiated by the American government after protests from Spain, although it was authorized in official instructions. About the same time, an attempt to organize a government at St. Mary's was made by American sympathizers, and a petty civil war began between the Americans, who called themselves patriots, and the Indians, who were encouraged by the Spanish. In 1814, British troops landed at Pensacola to begin operations against the United States. In retaliation, General Andrew Jackson captured the place, but in a few days withdrew to New Orleans. The British then built a fort on the Apalachicola River, and then directed expeditions of Indians and runaway Negroes against the American settlements, which continued long after peace was concluded in 1814. In 1818, General Jackson, inciting them to attack the Americans, again captured Pensacola. By the Treaty of 1819, Spain formally ceded East and West Florida to the United States. The treaty was ratified in 1821 when the United States took formal possession, but civil government was not established until 1822. On this day in history, March 31st, 1492, Queen Isabella of Castile issues the Alhambra Decree, ordering her 150,000 Jewish and Muslim subjects to convert to Christianity or face expulsion. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the Alhambra. The Alhambra, an ancient palace and fortress of the Moorish monarchs of Granada in southern Spain, occupying a hilly terrace on the southeastern border of the city of Granada. This terrace or plateau extends from west-northwest to east-southeast and covers an area of about 35 acres. It is enclosed by a strongly fortified wall, which is flanked by 13 towers. The palace was built chiefly between 1248 and 1354, in the reigns of Al-Hamar and his successors, but even the names of the principal artists employed are either unknown or doubtful. The splendid decorations of the interior are ascribed to Yusuf I, who died in 1354. Immediately after the expulsion of the Moors in 1492, their conquerors began by excessive acts of vandalism to spoil the marvelous beauty of the Alhambra. Charles V, 1516-56, rebuilt portions in the style of the period and destroyed the greater part of the Winter Palace to make room for a structure which has never been completed. Philip V, 1700-46, Italicized the rooms and completed the degradation by running up partitions which blocked up whole apartments, gems of taste and patient ingenuity. In 1821, an earthquake caused further damage. The work of restoration undertaken in 1828 by the architect José Contreras was endowed in 1830 by Ferdinand VII, and after the death of Contreras in 1847, it was continued with fair success by his son Rafael, died 1890, and his grandson Mariano. The situation of the Alhambra is one of rare natural beauty. The plateau commands a wide view of the city and plain of Granada, towards the west and north, and on the heights of the Sierra Nevada, towards the east and south. The park, Alameda de la Alhambra, which in spring is overgrown with wild flowers and grass, was planted by the Moors with roses, oranges, and myrtles. Its most characteristic feature, however, is the dense wood of English elms brought hither in 1812 by the Duke of Wellington. The Moorish portion of the Alhambra resembles many medieval Christian strongholds in its threefold arrangement as a castle, a palace, and a residential annex for subordinates. The Alcabeza, or citadel, its oldest part, is built on the isolated and precipitous foreland which terminates the plateau on the northwest. Only its massive outer walls, towers, and ramparts are left. Beyond the Alcazaba is the palace of the Moorish kings, or Alhambra, properly so called, and beyond this, again, in the Alhambra Alta, Upper Alhambra, originally tenanted by officials and courtiers. Access from the city to the Alhambra Park is afforded by the Puerta de las Granadas, Gate of the Pomegranates, a massive triumphal arch dating from the 15th century. A steep ascent leads past the Pillar of Charles V, a fountain erected in 1554, to the main entrance of the Alhambra. This is the Puerta Judiciaria, Gate of Judgment, a massive horseshoe archway surmounted by a square tower and used by the Moors as an informal court of justice. The present entrance to the Palacio Árabe, or Casa Real, is by a small door from which a corridor conducts to the Patio de las Arenas, Court of the Myrtles, also called the Patio de la Alberca, Court of the Blessing or Court of the Pond. This court is 140 feet long by 74 feet broad, and in the center there is a large pond set in the marble pavement, full of goldfish, and with myrtles growing along its sides. There are galleries on the north and south sides, that on the south 27 feet high and supported by a marble colonnade. Underneath it, to the right, was the principal entrance, and over it are 3 elegant windows with arches and miniature pillars. The Sala de los Embajadores, Hall of the Ambassadors, is the largest in the Alhambra, and occupies all the Torre de Camares. It is a square room, the sides being 37 feet in length, while the center of the dome is 75 feet high. This was the grand reception room, and the throne of the Sultan was placed opposite of the entrance. The celebrated Patio de Leones, Court of the Lions, is an oblong court, 116 feet in length by 66 feet in breadth, surrounded by a low gallery supported on 124 white marble columns. A pavilion projects into the court at each extremity, with filigree walls and light-domed roof, elaborately ornamented. The square is paved with colored tiles, and the colonnade with white marble, while the walls are covered 5 feet up from the ground with blue and yellow tiles, with a border above and below enameled blue and gold. In the center of the court is the celebrated Fountain of Lions, a magnificent alabaster basin supported by the figures of 12 lions in white marble, not designed with sculptural accuracy, but as emblems of strength and courage. The Sala de los Abencerrajes, Hall of the Abencerrages, derives its name from a legend according to which Boabdil, the last king of Granada, having invited the chiefs of that illustrious line to a banquet, massacred them here. This room is a perfect square with a lofty dome and trestled windows at its base. The room is exquisitely decorated in blue, brown, red, and gold, and the columns supporting it spring out into the arch form in a remarkably beautiful manner. Opposite to this wall is the Sala de los Dos Hermanas, Hall of the Two Sisters, so called from 2 very beautiful white marble slabs laid as part of the pavement. There is a fountain in the middle of this hall, and the roof, a dome honeycombed with tiny cells, all different, and said to number 5,000, is a magnificent example of the so-called stalactite vaulting of the Moors. The original furniture of the palace is represented by the celebrated vase of the Alhambra, a splendid specimen of Moorish ceramic art, dating from 1320, and belonging to the first period of Moorish porcelain. Of the outlying buildings in connection with the Alhambra, the foremost in interest is the Palacio de Generalife, or Generalife, the Moorish Genet Alefre, Garden of Arif, or Garden of the Architect. This villa probably dates from the end of the 13th century, but has been several times restored. The Villa de los Martires, Martyrs' Villa, on the summit of Montmayor, commemorates by its name the Christian slaves who were employed to build the Alhambra, and conified here in subterranean cells.